I say that the snow is massed and frozen around us and over us, and that we are buried alive. Let us try to clear this mass of snow away, replied the captain. The two friends buttressed themselves against the obstacle which obstructed the opening, but they could not move it. The snow formed an iceberg more than 5 feet thick and had become literally a part of the house. Jean could not suppress a cry which awoke Misson and Vasling. An oath burst from the latter, whose features contracted. At this moment the smoke, thicker than ever, poured into the house, for it could not find an issue. "Malediction!" cried Misson. "The pipe of the stove is sealed up by the ice." Penellan resumed his staff and took down the pipe, after throwing snow on the embers to extinguish them, which produced such a smoke that the light of the lamp could scarcely be seen. Then he tried with his staff to clear out the orifice, but he only encountered a rock of ice. A frightful end, preceded by a terrible agony, seemed to be their doom. The smoke, penetrating the throats of the unfortunate party, caused an insufferable pain, and air would soon fail them altogether. Marie here rose, and her presence, which inspired Cornbutt with despair, imparted some courage to Penellan. He said to himself that it could not be that the poor girl was destined to so horrible a death. "Ah," said she, "you have made too much fire. The room is full of smoke." "Yes, yes," stammered Penellan. "It is evident," resumed Marie, "for it is not cold, and it is long since we have felt too much heat." No one dared to tell her the truth. "See, Marie," said Penellan bluntly, "help us get breakfast ready. It is too cold to go out. Here is the chafing dish, the spirit, and the coffee. Come, you others, a little pemmican first, as this wretched storm forbids us from hunting." These words stirred up his comrades. "Let us first eat," added Penellan, "and then we shall see about getting off." Penellan set the example and devoured his share of the breakfast. His comrades imitated him and then drank a cup of boiling coffee, which somewhat restored their spirits. Then Jean Cornbutt decided energetically that they should at once set about devising means of safety. André Vasling now said, "If the storm is still raging, which is probable, we must be buried 10 feet under the ice, for we can hear no noise outside." Penellan looked at Marie, who now understood the truth and did not tremble. The helmsman first heated, by the flame of the spirit, the iron point of his staff, and successfully introduced it into the 4 walls of ice, but he could find no issue in either. Cornbutt then resolved to cut out an opening in the door itself. The ice was so hard that it was difficult for the knives to make the least impression on it. The pieces which were cut off soon encumbered the hut. After working hard for 2 hours, they had only hollowed out a space 3 feet deep. Some more rapid method, and one which was less likely to demolish the house, must be thought of, for the farther they advanced, the more violent became the effort to break off the compact ice. It occurred to Penellan to make use of the chafing dish to melt the ice in the direction they wanted. It was a hazardous method, for if their imprisonment lasted long, the spirit, of which they had but little, would be wanting when needed to prepare the meals. Nevertheless, the idea was welcomed on all hands and was put in execution. They first cut a hole 3 feet deep by 1 in diameter to receive the water which would result from the melting of the ice, and it was well that they took this precaution, for the water soon dripped under the action of the flames, which Penellan moved about under the mass of ice. The opening widened little by little, but this kind of work could not be continued long, for the water, covering their clothes, penetrated to their bodies here and there. Penellan was obliged to pause in a quarter of an hour and to withdraw the chafing dish in order to dry himself. Misson then took his place and worked sturdily at the task. In 2 hours, though the opening was 5 feet deep, the points of the staffs could not yet find an issue without. "It is not possible," said Jean Cornbutt, "that snow could have fallen in such abundance. It must have been gathered on this point by the wind. Perhaps we had better think of escaping in some other direction." "I don't know," replied Penellan, "but if it were only for the sake of not discouraging our comrades, we ought to continue to pierce the wall where we have begun. We must find an issue ere long." "Will not the spirit fail us?" asked the captain. "I hope not," but let us, if necessary, dispense with coffee and hot drinks. Besides, that is not what most alarms me." "What is it then, Penellan?" "Our lamp is going out for want of oil, and we are fast exhausting our provisions." "At last, thank God." Penellan went to replace André Vasling, who was vigorously working for the common deliverance. "Monsieur Vasling," said he, "I am going to take your place. But look out well, I beg of you, for every tendency of the house to fall, so that we may have time to prevent it." The time for rest had come, and when Penellan had added one more foot to the opening, he lay down beside his comrades. Chapter 11. A cloud of smoke. The next day when the sailors awoke, they were surrounded by complete darkness. The lamp had gone out. Jean Cornbutt roused Penellan to ask him for the tinderbox, which was passed to him. Penellan rose to light the fire, but in getting up, his head struck against the ice ceiling. He was horrified, for on the evening before he could still stand upright, the chafing dish being lighted up by the dim rays of the spirit, he perceived that the ceiling was a foot lower than before. Penellan resumed work with desperation. At this moment, the young girl observed, by the light which the chafing dish cast upon Penellan's face, that despair and determination were struggling in his rough features for the mastery. She went to him, took his hands, and tenderly pressed them. Despair and determination were struggling in his rough features for the mastery. "She must not die thus," he cried. He took his chafing dish, and once more attacked the narrow opening. He plunged in his staff, and felt no resistance. Had he reached the soft layers of the snow, he drew out his staff, and a bright ray penetrated to the house of ice. "Here, my friends," he shouted. He pushed back the snow with his hands and feet, but the exterior surface was not thawed, as he had thought. With the ray of light, a violent cold entered the cabin and seized upon everything moist, to freeze it in an instant. Penellan enlarged the opening with his cutlass, and at last was able to breathe the free air. He fell on his knees to thank God, and was soon joined by Marie and his comrades. A magnificent moon lit up the sky, but the cold was so extreme that they could not bear it. They re-entered their retreat, but Penellan first looked about him. The promontory was no longer there, and the hut was now in the midst of a vast plain of ice. Penellan thought he would go to the sledge, where the provisions were. The sledge had disappeared. The cold forced him to return. He said nothing to his companions. It was necessary, before all, to dry their clothing, which was done with the chafing dish. The thermometer, held for an instant in the air, descended to 30 degrees below zero. An hour after, Vasling and Penellan resolved to venture outside. They wrapped themselves up in their still wet garments and went out by the opening, the sides of which had become as hard as a rock. "We have been driven towards the northeast," said Vasling, reckoning by the stars, which shone with wonderful brilliancy. "That would not be bad," said Penellan, "if our sledge had come with us." "Is not the sledge there?" cried Vasling. "Then we are lost." "Let us look for it," replied Penellan. They went around the hut, which formed a block more than 15 feet high. An immense quantity of snow had fallen during the whole of the storm, and the wind had massed it against the only elevation which the plain presented. The entire block had been driven by the wind in the midst of the broken icebergs more than 25 miles to the northeast, and the prisoners had suffered the same fate as their floating prison. The sledge, supported by another iceberg, had been turned another way, for no trace of it was to be seen, and the dogs must have perished amid the frightful tempest. André Vasling and Penellan felt despair taking possession of them. They did not dare to return to their companions. They did not dare to announce this fatal news to their comrades in misfortune. They climbed upon the block of ice in which the hut was hollowed, and could perceive nothing but the white immensity which encompassed them on all sides. Already the cold was beginning to stiffen their limbs, and the damp of their garments was being transformed into icicles which hung about them. Just as Penellan was about to descend, he looked towards André. He saw him suddenly gaze in one direction, then shudder and turn pale. "What is the matter, Vasling?" he asked. "Nothing," replied the other. "Let us go down and urge the captain to leave these parts, where we ought never to have come, at once." Instead of obeying, Penelon ascended again and looked in the direction which had drawn the mate's attention. A very different effect was produced on him, for he uttered a shout of joy and cried, "Blessed be God!" A light smoke was rising in the northeast. There was no possibility of deception. It indicated the presence of human beings. Penelon's cries of joy reached the rest below, and all were able to convince themselves with their eyes that he was not mistaken. Without thinking of their want of provisions or the severity of the temperature, wrapped in their hoods, they were all soon advancing towards the spot whence the smoke arose in the northeast. This was evidently 5 or 6 miles off, and it was very difficult to take exactly the right direction. The smoke now disappeared, and no elevation served as a guiding mark, for the ice-plane was one united level. It was important, nevertheless, not to diverge from a straight line. "Since we cannot guide ourselves by distant objects," said Jean Cornbutt, "we must use this method. Penelon will go ahead, Vasling 20 steps behind him, and I 20 steps behind Vasling. I can then judge whether or not Penelon diverges from the straight line." They had gone on thus for half an hour, when Penelon suddenly stopped and listened. The party hurried up to him. "Did you hear nothing?" he asked. "Nothing," replied Misson. "It is strange," said Penelon. "It seemed to me I heard cries from this direction." "Cries," replied Marie. "Perhaps we are near our destination then." "That is no reason," said André Vasling. "In these high latitudes and cold regions sounds may be heard to a great distance." "However that may be," replied Jean Cornbutt, "let us go forward, or we shall be frozen." "No," cried Penelon, "listen." Some feeble sounds, quite perceptible, however, were heard. They seemed to be cries of distress. They were twice repeated. They seemed like cries for help. Then all became silent again. "I was not mistaken," said Penelon. "Forward." He began to run in the direction whence the cries had proceeded. He went thus 2 miles, when, to his utter stupefaction, he saw a man lying on the ice. He went up to him, raised him, and lifted his arms to heaven in despair. André Vasling, who was following close behind with the rest of the sailors, ran up and cried, "It is one of the castaways. It is our sailor Courtois." "He is dead," replied Penelon, "frozen to death." Jean Cornbutt and Marie came up beside the corpse, which was already stiffened by the ice. Despair was written on every face. The dead man was one of the comrades of Louis Cornbutt. "Forward," cried Penelon. They went on for half an hour in perfect silence, and perceived an elevation which seemed without doubt to be land. "It is Shannon Island," said Jean Cornbutt. A mile farther on they distinctly perceived smoke escaping from a snow hut closed by a wooden door. They shouted. 2 men rushed out of the hut, and Penelon recognized one of them as Pierre Nauquet. "Pierre," he cried. Pierre stood still as if stunned and unconscious of what was going on around him. André Vasling looked at Pierre Nauquet's companion with anxiety mingled with a cruel joy, for he did not recognize Louis Cornbutt in him. "Pierre, it is I," cried Penelon. "These are all your friends." Pierre Nauquet recovered his senses and fell into his old comrade's arms. "And my son and Louis," cried Jean Cornbutt in an accent of the most profound despair. Chapter 12. The Return to the Ship. At this moment, a man, almost dead, dragged himself out of the hut and along the ice. It was Louis Cornbutt. It was Louis Cornbutt. "My son! My beloved!" These 2 cries were uttered at the same time, and Louis Cornbutt fell fainting into the arms of his father and Marie, who drew him towards the hut, where their tender care soon revived him. "My father, Marie," cried Louis, "I shall not die without having seen you." "You will not die," replied Penelon, "for all your friends are near you." André Vasling must have hated Louis Cornbutt bitterly not to extend his hand to him, but he did not. Pierre Nauke was wild with joy. He embraced everybody, then he threw some wood into the stove, and soon a comfortable temperature was felt in the cabin. There were two men there whom neither Jean Cornbutt nor Penelon recognized. They were Jockey and Herming, the only two sailors of the crew of the Norwegian schooner who were left. "My friends, we are saved," said Louis. "My father, Marie, you have exposed yourselves to so many perils." "We do not regret it, my Louis," replied the father. "Your brig, the June Hardy, is securely anchored in the ice 60 leagues from here. We will rejoin her all together." "When Courtois comes back, he'll be mightily pleased," said Pierre Nauke. A mournful silence followed this, and Penelon apprised Pierre and Louis of their comrade's death by cold. "My friends," said Penelon, "we will wait here until the cold decreases. Have you provisions and wood?" "Yes, and we will burn what is left of the Fruin." The Fruin had indeed been driven to a place 40 miles from where Louis Cornbutt had taken up his winter quarters. There she was broken up by the icebergs floated by the thaw, and the castaways were carried, with a part of the debris of their cabin, on the southern shores of Shannon Island. They were then 5 in number: Louis Cornbutt, Courtois, Pierre Nauke, Jockey, and Herming. As for the rest of the Norwegian crew, they had been submerged with the longboat at the moment of the wreck. When Louis Cornbutt, shut in among the ice, realized what must happen, he took every precaution for passing the winter. He was an energetic man, very active and courageous, but despite his firmness, he had been subdued by this horrible climate, and when his father found him, he had given up all hope of life. He had not only had to contend with the elements, but with the ugly temper of the two Norwegian sailors who owed him their existence. They were like savages, almost inaccessible to the most natural emotions. When Louis had the opportunity to talk to Penelon, he advised him to watch them carefully. In return, Penelon told him of André Vasling's conduct. Louis could not believe it, but Penelon convinced him that after his disappearance, Vasling had always acted so as to secure Marie's hand. The whole day was employed in rest and the pleasures of reunion. Masson and Pierre Nauke killed some seabirds near the hut, whence it was not prudent to stray far. These fresh provisions and the replenished fire raised the spirits of the weakest. Louis Cornbutt got visibly better. It was the first moment of happiness these brave people had experienced. They celebrated it with enthusiasm in this wretched hut, 600 leagues from the North Sea, in a temperature of 30 degrees below zero. This temperature lasted till the end of the moon, and it was not until about the 17th of November, a week after their meeting, that Jean Cornbutt and his party could think of setting out. They only had the light of the stars to guide them, but the cold was less extreme, and even some snow fell. Before quitting this place, a grave was dug for poor Courtois. It was a sad ceremony which deeply affected his comrades. He was the first of them who would not again see his native land. Masson had constructed, with the planks of the cabin, a sort of sledge for carrying the provisions, and the sailors drew it by turns. Jean Cornbutt led the expedition by the ways already traversed. Camps were established with great promptness when the times for repose came. Jean Cornbutt hoped to find his deposits of provisions again, as they had become well-nigh indispensable by the addition of 4 persons to the party. He was therefore very careful not to diverge from the route by which he had come. By good fortune he recovered his sledge, which had stranded near the promontory where they had all run so many dangers. The dogs, after eating their straps to satisfy their hunger, had attacked the provisions in the sledge. These had sustained them, and they served to guide the party to the sledge, where there was a considerable quantity of provisions left. The little band resumed its march towards the bay. The dogs were harnessed to the sleigh, and no event of interest attended the return. It was observed that Oppik, André Vasling, and the Norwegians kept aloof, and did not mingle with the others, but unbeknown to themselves, they were narrowly watched. This germ of dissension more than once aroused the fears of Louis Cornbutt and Penelon. About the 7th of December, 20 days after the discovery of the castaways, they perceived the bay where the June Hardy was lying. What was their astonishment to see the brig perched 4 yards in the air on blocks of ice. They hurried forward, much alarmed for their companions, and were received with joyous cries by Jervik, Turquiet, and Gradlin. All of them were in good health, though they too had been subjected to formidable dangers. The tempest had made itself felt throughout the polar sea. The ice had been broken and displaced, crushed one piece against another, and had seized the bed on which the ship rested. Though its specific weight tended to carry it under water, the ice had acquired an incalculable force, and the brig had been suddenly raised up out of the sea. The first moments were given up to the happiness inspired by the safe return. The exploring party were rejoiced to find everything in good condition, which assured them a supportable though it might be a rough winter. The ship had not been shaken by her sudden elevation and was perfectly tight. When the season of thawing came, they would only have to slide her down an inclined plane to launch her, in a word, in the once more open sea. But a bad piece of news spread gloom on the faces of Jean Cornbutt and his comrades. During the terrible gale, the snow storehouse on the coast had been quite demolished. The provisions which it contained were scattered, and it had not been possible to save a morsel of them. When Jean and Louis Cornbutt learnt this, they visited the hold and steward's room to ascertain the quantity of provisions which still remained. The thaw would not come until May, and the brig could not leave the bay before that period. They had therefore 5 winter months before them to pass amid the ice, during which 14 persons were to be fed. Having made his calculations, Jean Cornbutt found that he would at most be able to keep them alive till the time for departure, by putting each and all on half rations. Hunting for game became compulsory to procure food in larger quantity. For fear that they might again run short of provisions, it was decided to deposit them no longer in the ground. All of them were kept on board, and beds were disposed for the newcomers in the common lodging. Turquiette, Jervic, and Gradlin, during the absence of the others, had hollowed out a flight of steps in the ice, which enabled them easily to reach the ship's deck. Chapter 13. The Two Rivals. André Vasling had been cultivating the goodwill of the 2 Norwegian sailors. Opic also made one of their band, and held himself apart, with loud disapproval of all the new measures taken. But Louis Cornbutt, to whom his father had transferred the command of the ship, and who had become once more master on board, would listen to no objections from that quarter, and in spite of Marie's advice to act gently, made it known that he intended to be obeyed on all points. Nevertheless, the 2 Norwegians succeeded, 2 days after, in getting possession of a box of salt meat. Louis ordered them to return it to him on the spot, but Opic took their part, and André Vasling declared that the precautions about the food could not be any longer enforced. It was useless to attempt to show these men that these measures were for the common interest, for they knew it well, and only sought a pretext to revolt. Penelon advanced towards the Norwegians, who drew their cutlasses, but aided by Masson and Turquiette, he succeeded in snatching the weapons from their hands and gained possession of the salt meat. André Vasling and Opic, seeing that matters were going against them, did not interfere. Louis Cornbutt, however, took the mate aside and said to him, Penelon advanced towards the Norwegians. André Vasling, you are a wretch. I know your whole conduct, and I know what you are aiming at, but as the safety of the whole crew is confided to me, if any man of you thinks of conspiring to destroy them, I will stab him with my own hand. Louis Cornbutt, replied the mate, it is allowable for you to act the master, but remember that absolute obedience does not exist here, and that here the strongest alone makes the law. Marie had never trembled before the dangers of the polar seas, but she was terrified by this hatred, of which she was the cause, and the captain's vigor hardly reassured her. Despite this declaration of war, the meals were partaken of in common and at the same hours. Hunting furnished some ptarmigans and white hares, but this resource would soon fail them with the approach of the terrible cold weather. This began at the solstice, on the 22nd of December, on which day the thermometer fell to 35 degrees below zero. The men experienced pain in their ears, noses, and the extremities of their bodies. They were seized with a mortal torpor combined with headache, and their breathing became more and more difficult. In this state, they had no longer any courage to go hunting or to take any exercise. They remained crouched around the stove, which gave them but a meager heat, and when they went away from it, they perceived that their blood suddenly cooled. Jean Cornbutt's health was seriously impaired, and he could no longer quit his lodging. Symptoms of scurvy manifested themselves in him, and his legs were soon covered with white spots. Marie was well, however, and occupied herself tending the sick ones with the zeal of a sister of charity. The honest fellows blessed her from the bottom of their hearts. The 1st of January was one of the gloomiest of these winter days. The wind was violent and the cold insupportable. They could not go out except at the risk of being frozen. The most courageous were fain to limit themselves to walking on deck, sheltered by the tent. Jean Cornbutt, Jervik, and Gradlin did not leave their beds. The 2 Norwegians, Oppik and Andre Vasling, whose health was good, cast ferocious looks at their companions, whom they saw wasting away. Louis Cornbutt led Penelon on deck and asked him how much firing was left. "The coal was exhausted long ago," replied Penelon, "and we are about to burn our last pieces of wood." "If we are not able to keep off this cold, we are lost," said Louis. "There still remains a way," said Penelon, "to burn what we can of the brig, from the barricading to the waterline, and we can even, if need be, demolish her entirely and rebuild a smaller craft." "That is an extreme means," replied Louis, "which it will be full time to employ when our men are well. For," he added in a low voice, "our force is diminishing, and that of our enemies seems to be increasing. That is extraordinary." "It is true," said Penelon, "and unless we took the precaution to watch night and day, I know not what would happen to us." "Let us take our hatchets," returned Louis, "and make our harvest of wood." Despite the cold, they mounted on the forward barricading and cut off all the wood which was not indispensably necessary to the ship. Then they returned with this new provision. The fire was started afresh, and a man remained on guard to prevent it from going out. Meanwhile, Louis Cornbutt and his friends were soon tired out. They could not confide any detail of the life in common to their enemies. Charged with all the domestic cares, their powers were soon exhausted. The scurvy betrayed itself in Jean Cornbutt, who suffered intolerable pain. Jervik and Gradlin showed symptoms of the same disease. Had it not been for the lemon juice with which they were abundantly furnished, they would have speedily succumbed to their sufferings. This remedy was not spared in relieving them. But one day, the 15th of January, when Louis Cornbutt was going down into the steward's room to get some lemons, he was stupefied to find that the barrels in which they were kept had disappeared. He hurried up and told Penelon of this misfortune. A theft had been committed, and it was easy to recognize its authors. Louis Cornbutt then understood why the health of his enemies continued so good. His friends were no longer strong enough to take the lemons away from them, though his life and that of his comrades depended on the fruit, and he now sank, for the first time, into a gloomy state of despair. Chapter 14. Distress. On the 20th of January, most of the crew had not the strength to leave their beds. Each, independently of his woolen coverings, had a buffalo skin to protect him against the cold. But as soon as he put his arms outside the clothes, he felt a pain which obliged him quickly to cover them again. Meanwhile, Louis having lit the stove fire, Penelon, Masson, and Andre Vasling left their beds and crouched around it. Penelon prepared some boiling coffee, which gave them some strength, as well as Marie, who joined them in partaking of it. Louis Cornbutt approached his father's bedside. The old man was almost motionless, and his limbs were helpless from disease. He muttered some disconnected words, which carried grief to his son's heart. "Louis," said he, "I am dying. Oh, how I suffer, save me." Louis took a decisive resolution. He went up to the mate, and controlling himself with difficulty, said, "Do you know where the lemons are, Vasling?" "In the steward's room, I suppose," returned the mate without stirring. "You know they are not there, as you have stolen them." "You are master, Louis Cornbutt, and may say and do anything." "For pity's sake, Andre Vasling, my father is dying. You can save him, answer." "I have nothing to answer," replied Andre Vasling. "Wretch," cried Penelon, throwing himself, cutlass in hand, on the mate. "Help, friends," shouted Vasling, retreating. Oppik and the 2 Norwegian sailors jumped from their beds and placed themselves behind him. Turquiet, Penelon, and Louis prepared to defend themselves. Pierre Nauke and Gradlin, though suffering much, rose to second them. "You are still too strong for us," said Vasling. "We do not wish to fight on an uncertainty." The sailors were so weak that they dared not attack the four rebels, for had they failed, they would have been lost. "André Vasling," said Louis Cornbutte in a gloomy tone, "if my father dies, you will have murdered him, and I will kill you like a dog." Vasling and his confederates retired to the other end of the cabin and did not reply. It was then necessary to renew the supply of wood, and in spite of the cold, Louis went on deck and began to cut away a part of the barricading, but was obliged to retreat in a quarter of an hour, for he was in danger of falling, overcome by the freezing air. As he passed, he cast a glance at the thermometer left outside and saw that the mercury was frozen. The cold, then, exceeded 42 degrees below zero. The weather was dry and the wind blew from the north. On the 26th, the wind changed to the northeast, and the thermometer outside stood at 35 degrees. Jean Cornbutte was in agony, and his son had searched in vain for some remedy with which to relieve his pain. On this day, however, throwing himself suddenly on Vasling, he managed to snatch a lemon from him which he was about to suck. Vasling made no attempt to recover it. He seemed to be awaiting an opportunity to accomplish his wicked designs. The lemon juice somewhat relieved old Cornbutte, but it was necessary to continue the remedy. Marie begged Vasling on her knees to produce the lemons, but he did not reply, and soon Penelon heard the wretch say to his accomplices. Marie begged Vasling on her knees to produce the lemons, but he did not reply. "The old fellow is dying. Javik, Gradlin, and Nauke are not much better. The others are daily losing their strength. The time is near when their lives will belong to us." It was then resolved by Louis Cornbutte and his adherents not to wait, and to profit by the little strength which still remained to them. They determined to act the next night, and to kill these wretches so as not to be killed by them. The temperature rose a little. Louis Cornbutte ventured to go out with his gun in search of some game. He proceeded some 3 miles from the ship, and often, deceived by the effects of the mirage and refraction, he went farther away than he intended. It was imprudent, for recent tracks of ferocious animals were to be seen. He did not wish, however, to return without some fresh meat, and continued on his route, but he then experienced a strange feeling which turned his head. It was what is called white vertigo. The reflection of the ice hillocks and fields affected him from head to foot, and it seemed to him that the dazzling color penetrated him and caused an irresistible nausea. His eye was attacked. His sight became uncertain. He thought he should go mad with the glare. Without fully understanding this terrible effect, he advanced on his way and soon put up a ptarmigan, which he eagerly pursued. The bird soon fell, and in order to reach it, Louis leaped from an ice block and fell heavily, for the leap was at least 10 feet, and the refraction made him think it was only 2. The vertigo then seized him, and without knowing why he began to call for help, though he had not been injured by the fall. The cold began to take him, and he rose with pain, urged by the sense of self-preservation. Suddenly, without being able to account for it, he smelt an odor of boiling fat. As the ship was between him and the wind, he supposed that this odor proceeded from her, and could not imagine why they should be cooking fat, this being a dangerous thing to do, as it was likely to attract the white bears. Louis returned towards the ship, absorbed in reflections which soon inspired his excited mind with terror. It seemed to him as if colossal masses were moving on the horizon, and he asked himself if there was not another icequake. Several of these masses interposed themselves between him and the ship, and appeared to rise about its sides. He stopped to gaze at them more attentively, when to his horror he recognized a herd of gigantic bears. These animals had been attracted by the odor of grease which had surprised Lannes. He sheltered himself behind a hillock and counted 3, which were scaling the blocks on which the Junehardy was resting. Nothing led him to suppose that this danger was known in the interior of the ship, and a terrible anguish oppressed his heart. How resist these redoubtable enemies? Would André Vasling and his confederates unite with the rest on board in the common peril? Could Penelon and the others, half-starved, benumbed with cold, resist these formidable animals, made wild by unassuaged hunger? Would they not be surprised by an unlooked-for attack? Louis made these reflections rapidly. The bears had crossed the blocks and were mounting to the assault of the ship. He might then quit the block which protected him. He went nearer, clinging to the ice, and could soon see the enormous animals tearing the tent with their paws and leaping on the deck. He thought of firing his gun to give his comrades notice, but if these came up without arms, they would inevitably be torn in pieces, and nothing showed as yet that they were even aware of their new danger. Chapter 15. The White Bears. After Louis Cornbutt's departure, Penelon had carefully shut the cabin door, which opened at the foot of the deck steps. He returned to the stove, which he took it upon himself to watch, whilst his companions regained their berths in search of a little warmth. It was then 6 in the evening, and Penelon set about preparing supper. He went down into the steward's room for some salt meat, which he wished to soak in the boiling water. When he returned, he found André Vasling in his place, cooking some pieces of grease in a basin. "I was there before you," said Penelon roughly. "Why have you taken my place?" "For the same reason that you claim it," returned Vasling, "because I want to cook my supper." "You will take that off at once, or we shall see." "We shall see nothing," said Vasling. "My supper shall be cooked in spite of you." "You shall not eat it then," cried Penelon, rushing upon Vasling, who seized his cutlass, crying, "Help, Norwegians, help Opic!" These, in the twinkling of an eye, sprang to their feet, armed with pistols and daggers. The crisis had come. Penelon precipitated himself upon Vasling, to whom no doubt was confided the task to fight him alone, for his accomplices rushed to the beds where lay Misson, Turquiet, and Nauke. The latter, ill and defenseless, was delivered over to Herming's ferocity. The carpenter seized a hatchet, and leaving his berth, hurried up to encounter Opic. Turquiet and Jockey, the Norwegian, struggled fiercely. Jervik and Gradlin, suffering horribly, were not even conscious of what was passing around them. Nauke soon received a stab in the side, and Herming turned to Penelon, who was fighting desperately. André Vasling had seized him round the body. At the beginning of the affray, the basin had been upset on the stove, and the grease running over the burning coals impregnated the atmosphere with its odor. Marie rose with cries of despair and hurried to the bed of old Jean Cornbutt. Marie rose with cries of despair and hurried to the bed of old Jean Cornbutt. Vasling, less strong than Penelon, soon perceived that the latter was getting the better of him. They were too close together to make use of their weapons. The mate, seeing Herming, cried out, "Help, Herming!" "Help, Misson!" shouted Penelon in his turn. But Misson was rolling on the ground with Opic, who was trying to stab him with his cutlass. The carpenter's hatchet was of little use to him, for he could not wield it, and it was with the greatest difficulty that he parried the lunges which Opic made with his knife. Meanwhile blood flowed amid the groans and cries. Turquiet, thrown down by Jockey, a man of immense strength, had received a wound in the shoulder, and he tried in vain to clutch a pistol which hung in the Norwegian's belt. The latter held him as in a vice, and it was impossible for him to move. At Vasling's cry for help, who was being held by Penelon close against the door, Herming rushed up. As he was about to stab the Breton's back with his cutlass, the latter felled him to the earth with a vigorous kick. His effort to do this enabled Vasling to disengage his right arm, but the door, against which they pressed with all their weight, suddenly yielded, and Vasling fell over. Of a sudden a terrible growl was heard, and a gigantic bear appeared on the steps. Vasling saw him first. He was not 4 feet away from him. At the same moment a shot was heard, and the bear, wounded or frightened, retreated. Vasling, who had succeeded in regaining his feet, set out in pursuit of him, abandoning Penelon. Penelon then replaced the door and looked around him. Misson and Turquiet, tightly garroted by their antagonists, had been thrown into a corner and made vain efforts to break loose. Penelon rushed to their assistance, but was overturned by the 2 Norwegians and Opic. His exhausted strength did not permit him to resist these 3 men, who so clung to him as to hold him motionless. Then, at the cries of the mate, they hurried on deck, thinking that Louis Cornbutt was to be encountered. André Vasling was struggling with a bear, which he had already twice stabbed with his knife. The animal, beating the air with his heavy paws, was trying to clutch Vasling. He, retiring little by little on the barricading, was apparently doomed when a second shot was heard. The bear fell. André Vasling raised his head and saw Louis Cornbutt in the ratlins of the mizzen mast, his gun in his hand. Louis had shot the bear in the heart, and he was dead. Hate overcame gratitude in Vasling's breast, but before satisfying it, he looked around him. Opic's head was broken by a paw stroke, and he lay lifeless on deck. Jockey, hatchet in hand, was with difficulty parrying the blows of the second bear, which had just killed Opic. The animal had received 2 wounds and still struggled desperately. A third bear was directing his way towards the ship's prow. Vasling paid no attention to him, but followed by Herming, went to the aid of Jockey. But Jockey, seized by the beast's paws, was crushed, and when the bear fell under the shots of the other 2 men, he held only a corpse in his shaggy arms. "We are only 2 now," said Vasling with gloomy ferocity, "but if we yield, it will not be without vengeance." Herming reloaded his pistol without replying. Before all, the third bear must be got rid of. Vasling looked forward, but did not see him. On raising his eyes, he perceived him erect on the barricading, clinging to the ratlins and trying to reach Louis. Vasling let his gun fall, which he had aimed at the animal, while a fierce joy glittered in his eyes. "Ah," he cried, "you owe me that vengeance." Louis took refuge in the top of the mast. The bear kept mounting and was not more than 6 feet from Louis when he raised his gun and pointed it at the animal's heart. Vasling raised his weapon to shoot Louis if the bear fell. Louis fired, but the bear did not appear to be hit, for he leaped with a bound towards the top. The whole mast shook. Vasling uttered a shout of exultation. "Herming," he cried, "go and find Marie, go and find my betrothed." Herming descended the cabin stairs. Meanwhile, the furious beast had thrown himself upon Louis, who was trying to shelter himself on the other side of the mast. But at the moment that his enormous paw was raised to break his head, Louis, seizing one of the backstays, let himself slip down to the deck, not without danger, for a ball hissed by his ear when he was halfway down. Vasling had shot at him and missed him. The 2 adversaries now confronted each other, cutlass in hand. The combat was about to become decisive. To entirely glut his vengeance, and to have the young girl witness her lover's death, Vasling had deprived himself of Herming's aid. He could now reckon only on himself. Louis and Vasling seized each other by the collar and held each other with iron grip. One of them must fall. They struck each other violently. The blows were only half parried, for blood soon flowed from both. Vasling tried to clasp his adversary about the neck with his arm to bring him to the ground. Louis, knowing that he who fell was lost, prevented him and succeeded in grasping his 2 arms, but in doing this, he let fall his cutlass. Piteous cries now assailed his ears. It was Marie's voice. Herming was trying to drag her up. Louis was seized with a desperate rage. He stiffened himself to bend Vasling's loins, but at this moment the combatants felt themselves seized in a powerful embrace. The bear, having descended from the mast, had fallen upon the 2 men. Vasling was pressed against the animal's body. Louis felt his claws entering his flesh. The bear was strangling both of them. The bear, having descended from the mast, had fallen upon the 2 men. "Help, help, Herming," cried the mate. "Help, Penellan," cried Louis. Steps were heard on the stairs. Penellan appeared, loaded his pistol, and discharged it in the bear's ear. He roared. The pain made him relax his paws for a moment, and Louis, exhausted, fell motionless on the deck. But the bear, closing his paws tightly in a supreme agony, fell, dragging down the wretched Vasling, whose body was crushed under him. Penellan hurried to Louis Cornbutt's assistance. No serious wound endangered his life. He had only lost his breath for a moment. "Marie," he said, opening his eyes. "Saved," replied Penellan. "Herming is lying there with a knife wound in his stomach." "And the bears?" "Dead, Louis, dead like our enemies, but for those beasts we should have been lost. Truly they came to our succor. Let us thank heaven."